welcome to Canonical. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by Iad Darris,
Hey,
Iad, and Sam Spieler.
Hello.
Hey, Sam. Today we are reviewing the second book in our series on race in contemporary America with American Indian author Tommy Orange's bombshell debut novel, There, There. As a note for you, our audience, we will not reveal any spoilers here, so if you haven't read the book yet, that's fine. Just keep on listening. Now, Sam, this was your pick for our series on race in contemporary America. So why don't you start us off with a brief overview?
Sure. Tommy Orange is a man in his 30s. He's of the Cheyenne and Arapaho nations. He grew up in Oakland, California. There, as you said, is his debut novel, which released 2 years ago in 2018. It was a finalist for the 2019 Pulitzer, and that same year he won the American Book Awards for this. He studied under Pam Houston, who all three of us have at least a passing connection with through our time at UC Davis. This book functions similarly to a story cycle, except that each chapter does not really function as its own standalone story, I think, but rather as the sort of storm of interconnected narratives from a dozen or so characters that swirl around and eventually focus on a big powwow in Oakland.
I like that a lot, Sam. Storm. Is that your phrase, or did you pick it up from somewhere?
That's mine.
Oh, you should trademark that. It's good stuff.
All right. Through that storm and through the eyes of these characters, we are presented with myriad stories that are specific, yet at this point, familiar to many, but forgotten or ignored by even more. This novel is about interconnectedness and the struggle to maintain or claim Native identity in multiple ways, and how the Native community continues to be defined by cyclical generational trauma and the near impossibility of thriving and moving forward with so many issues threatening survival as minorities within a minority group.
Before we get too in-depth, let's all give a one-sentence review of this book. So who wants to start?
Yeah, as I've already sort of said, this is a complex web of stories and generational trauma, and one that is hard to swallow and sometimes difficult to keep straight. But I feel that's by design and adds to its overall message of inviting the reader to bear witness to the continued hardships, both realized and not. I give it a 9 out of 10.
whoa, 9 out of 10.
Good sentence, but I think that might have been two sentences.
I wrote it as one, but maybe it's a run-on.
He's got a semicolon in there.
What do you think, Iad?
My one sentence review is it's beautiful sadness for people who love sadness as much as anyone can love sadness.
Oh, that's good. I'd say it's a fantastic debut novel, and it's a very important novel, but it's also very confusing to follow.
Like out of 10, I got the sense that 9 is high for both of you.
I feel like it's a strong novel. It's especially strong for a debut novel. I don't really love quantifying things that way, but I do think it's much better than most debut novels. If I have to do it, I might go with an 8.
Yeah, I'd be a bit lower, but I think it's a important novel. So in some ways, it's more relevant to what we're going to talk about in terms of, I think the importance is more relevant in some ways than the quality, I guess. So, Sam, do you want to start us off with a more in-depth review then?
Yeah, why does it get a 9?
Yes, that's what I want to know.
The relationships were definitely difficult to follow. There are a lot of characters, and they're all connected in some distant or in some ways very intimate ways. But even though I forgot who a couple characters were partway through, I was usually able to figure it out without too much effort. I know that's not doesn't sound like a 9, But to me, the large number of central characters with very different but also very similar and related problems was part of the point of it. And I don't think it would have worked another way. For example, without giving much away, there's a character, Dean Oxendine. If we saw everything through his eyes, he's the one chronicling different stories of American Indians around the Bay Area. If we saw everything through his eyes, I think something would be lost, just having one person's perspective. I think that having all of these characters really added to the complexity. I also described this to you guys off air before as a gut punch, but it's more like the apparatus that Alex from A Clockwork Orange is subjected to, where he has to view all these hideous crimes while strapped to a chair. Someone is punching you in the stomach, but they wait for you to breathe just a little, and then they say, "Ready? Here comes another." We're not supposed to feel comfortable about it. And that pain was strong throughout. And even if I couldn't identify with it, I felt like I understood some small quantum about it. I'd have a question for you guys later about sections that you thought were lacking. Even the section that I felt started off as the least interesting, by the end of that, I was hooked. And I knew, even from the beginning of it, why it was there.
What section was it?
The section for me was Blue's backstory when she was still in Oklahoma.
I thought that was really strong, actually, especially the end. I thought that was really, really well done.
I agree. What I'm saying is at the very beginning of that section, I was not drawn in. By the end of it, I was completely hooked.
I think that section reads to me like a short story, and this is one of those debut novel characteristics that I can't really get over. It's a great short story. If you pluck it out, it totally stands on its own. But I get short story vibes from that one. I also get short story vibes from Edwin's chapter where he's constipated.
I assume a lot of these were, but there's also a lot of sections that definitely are not short stories on their own. I imagine he wrote a lot of these and then found a way to connect them all.
For me, I would say that what prevents most of the sections from having the short story vibe is the fact that we know from the outset of the novel that it's going to culminate in the powwow. And because we have this structure similar to what we have seen in Murakami's Kafka on the Shore, where we have people whose paths are eventually going to converge, that always hangs in the back of your mind as you're reading. You see these paths and you know that at some point they're going to intersect, and that carries the plot outside of the short story realm and into the novel realm.
Yeah, I mean, that's like a pretty basic short story cycle structure. Like, there are a lot of short story cycles that do this. So I think it blurs the line between the two. I don't really care if it's categorized as a novel or a short story, but it definitely carries the reader along. The parts feel very knit together enough for me to want to read the next chapter. So we're talking about like how they all kind of converge onto the powwow. I kind of like that because I think it's this underlying theme of the need for connection and the need for people to come together, right? Was that what you were saying, Sam? Where there's a need for this kind of structure or this form?
Yes. Well, that, and it's a collective trauma, but the aspects of that trauma, there's such a multitude of ways that trauma is expressed. There's so many stories. He touches on a lot of them here, from missing Native women to abuse to alcoholism to loss of identity in general to losing connection with the land or having that land connection be replaced by connection to a city and how that differs. I think if we just had one or two or even half as many characters, I think it might have come off as more forced than it does here. And I felt like they were all written very well, too. There weren't characters that stood out to me as, well, this one feels just like this other one. They all felt very unique to me.
Well, Sam, let's talk about that trauma, because this is what I was kind of getting at when I called it beautiful sadness. I agree that it's very well written, but a lot of times I felt like it was sadness either just for the sake of sadness and the fact that Tommy can pull it off. He can write so well that sadness becomes beautiful in his work. But I felt like it wasn't enough. It was sad, but there wasn't the transformative experience that we might get from a novel like Their Eyes Were Watching God, which I think also shows kind of the after effects of a trauma, a personal trauma, or a trauma inflicted upon a race of people. But because in that novel, Janie transforms as a result of her trauma, it elevates the story beyond just sad things happening.
This is something I've noticed a lot in Native American fiction. And I'm not saying this as an indictment or a justification, because so much of the Native American experience, and I'm not Native American, so caveat about me speaking about the Native American experience, obviously, but so much of the Native American experience is this cyclical poverty and suffering that's come from a history of genocide, right? The extremely high suicide rates, the extremely high rates of alcoholism, the feeling of entrapment. Native American fiction is about that. So for me, it's very much in that vein of Native American literature. For me, it actually doesn't cover a lot of new ground, except for the fact that it's set in an urban setting, which is important. But all of this focus on like the struggle, it's something that I feel like I have read before. I don't know if I feel about it the same way as you yet, but it definitely is something that I noticed, that there was such a preponderance of sadness.
It works better for people who are maybe less aware of Native issues and less aware of Native lives, especially, a lot of reviewers are lauding the prologue. They think that the prologue is especially well, which is an essay type section of writing about the historical aspects of Native suffering. And I think for people who aren't aware of the history behind these people's lives, it is very illuminating. But if you are more or less aware of the history, it just comes off perhaps as a little bit overly didactic. It aims to teach you something, and the value of a lesson decreases the more you know the content of that lesson.
I suppose so. If you have a lot of something already, but not a whole lot has been done to fix those issues, and then you have something new that's done like this, and it's done well, I don't think that's a bad thing. To me, that's part of the point of why there's this profound sadness here, this deep and unmoving sadness. Unmoving as in like a rock that just sits there. That's part of the point of this is you're not supposed to feel comfortable. I agree that if you are already familiar with these things, it's maybe not new. But again, it's not new because it hasn't gone away. It's an updated version of things we may have seen before, but we're seeing them again because it's still the same.
Even though, I've read a lot of Native American writers, I actually thought that introduction was fantastic. And I mean, it's not anything I didn't know before, but it's just so well written. And I think it is actually one of the stronger parts of the book. I actually don't think his prose is strong throughout. I think his prose is especially strong when he writes in that kind of non-fiction tone, his kind of essayist tone. I think in those sections, his prose is really good. You do need to have that up front, because part of the problem, and this is more of a social justice issue, but part of the problem is even today, our awareness of American Indian genocide, the genocide that America inflicted on American Indians, is whitewashed. In some ways, it's much more whitewashed than other American atrocities. I think even in textbooks today, you don't really focus on the genocide, but you focus on, the Pilgrims came and then they had dinner with the Indians. It's very much an issue nowadays still, which is why I think it's important to have at the beginning of the book. And I thought it was pretty strong. It's a bit unfair in that it's been lauded as such a unique book by critics, but I think the really unique part is it's set in Oakland. That's what sets it apart. I don't think any of the other elements actually are that unique. I think it's all conventional Native American themes, which are important. But I think the truly unique part of this that I thought was really interesting was how it's set in an urban setting, and specifically in Oakland.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because that's one of the things that I really connected with. We're all fairly familiar with the Bay Area and Oakland specifically, but I really loved that setting and seeing the history of the area from another perspective. And I know it's a shallow thing to be excited about for the setting of a book, but I connected with everything from the 1989 earthquakes. And I remember when he was talking about the Oakland Coliseum, he was talking in two different eras, really. He was talking about how it used to look in the 70s and 80s and how it looks now, which is very different. It used to be a very pretty stadium. And he mentioned the Denny's that's on Hegenberger Road, just outside the stadium. It's not a nostalgic book at all. And yet I still connected with the setting really easily.
I want to say two things here. First, just to go back very quickly, before I was a little bit critical of the prologue, and I just want to acknowledge kind of my privilege, because I do think it is a privilege for me as a non-native person to read a depiction of this kind of trauma, this racial trauma, and to say, well, that's old news. And I think that as a non-native person, for me to say, well, this is old, it's because I have the privilege of not having to live with it every day. When I criticize the prologue, it's just me criticizing it from an aesthetic point of view in terms of how it works as a piece of art in a piece of fiction. In terms of the Oakland references, I did enjoy it just because it's always nice to see something that you're familiar with in fiction. One thing that I got a little bit uptight about is the sense of gatekeeping ownership of Oakland that we saw in some of the characters when they were talking about white people and people of other races. That to me kind of rubbed me the wrong way.
I was going to bring up the fact that there are a lot of things around the Bay Area that are still connected to that trauma. For example, Bayview, or no, what is it called? The mall in Emeryville.
Bay Street.
Bay Street, thank you. That's built on a burial ground. And they dug up like 100 bodies maybe to reinter them somewhere else. But there's a lot of stipulation that there are hundreds more, if not more than that, still under there. So there are people that still protest that mall, even though it's been there for a while now. So there's things like that all over the Bay Area. And I agree about the gatekeeping, but I understand why also.
My feeling is that it might be incidental to complain so much about how they kind of prize Oakland as their own thing, but I feel like it is significant to this novel that it happens in Oakland. As James mentioned, the biggest new thing that this novel offers is the story of the urban native person. And that, to me, I feel makes it significant. But I also feel like even though that's the biggest new thing that the novel offers, it's not done as thoroughly as it could have been.
Yeah, I think, for example, to kind of expand on that point a little bit yet, I think that he likens gentrification to the replacement of Native Americans. It's an easy comparison, a thematic comparison to make, but he doesn't really get into gentrification, so it's given short shrift. That's a big issue that Oakland natives face, but it's kind of just cast aside. So in a lot of ways, it's not about Oakland, and in some ways, it doesn't really focus in on the urban experience as it could have. So I feel the same way. I'd like to see more in that vein, actually.
Yeah, I mean, it felt awkward to me because these are people who, further back, they have ancestry usually near Oklahoma. And they've come to the West Coast seeking a better life or a different lifestyle. And to me, it just feels like that's pretty much the same reason why anybody moves. I don't feel like it's a fair criticism to make.
I'd like to talk a bit about the multiple points of view that you mentioned earlier, Sam. You said that it was a bit confusing for you. I actually found it really confusing, and frustratingly so. Even though I wanted to keep reading because I wanted to see what was going to go down at the powwow, it was very, very hard for me to keep everyone straight. I found myself constantly flipping back to that initial section where he kind of has his cast of characters. And when a writer has that, it's kind of like a a note to the reader, hey, you better start taking notes because it's going to be tough. Because a writer does not want to put that at the beginning of the book. So I actually found that really frustrating. It did actually detract from my enjoyment of the novel.
The only point where I got a little bit confused was I'm not sure exactly what their ethnicity is, but it felt like a Mexican American family. Like there was Octavio Gomez and the other people in his family. I wasn't sure of their relationship all the time, but the other characters I felt like I could keep straight.
Yeah, that's actually how I felt too, yeah. And that family is something I'd like to talk about more in the discussion part, because I think they are at odds with some of the other characters in multiple ways. But I agree, their relationships to each other were a little harder to follow. And I think he probably knew that. He even has two characters that, was it Calvin and Charles?
Yeah, Charlos.
Charlos, yeah. And so Octavio purposely confuses them. It did make it a little hard for me, but I was okay with that.
Okay, well, let's take a break, and when we get back, we'll talk about who we would recommend this novel to. Okay, welcome back. So, who would you recommend there to?
People that can deal with profound sadness and one that is rooted very much in reality.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's best for people who are more unaware of what's going on in the native community and the struggles of the native life. For those people, it'll definitely be an eye opener. Even if people are aware of it, it's beautifully written, and I think that anybody can enjoy that.
Do you think some of the concerns that we raised earlier might keep you from recommending it? For example, that it might be too confusing? Would you think, let's say, your aunt, would you recommend it to your aunt who doesn't read a lot of books?
It wouldn't be the first thing. I think it's not a challenging book in the sense that it's a book that's for quote unquote smart people. It's just that it does require a bit of active reading just to keep the characters straight, but it's not really that hard to read.
Yeah, it does have kind of the everyman language.
I think it also offers, while I don't know if that I would recommend this to history buffs specifically, it does offer interesting things about California and the Bay Area that you don't see as often other places. For example, the section that talks about the Alcatraz protests in the 70s, there was a big protest by a large group of American Indians who occupied Alcatraz Island in the San Francisco Bay. And in the book, we see several of the characters as part of that protest. And we don't know all of their connections until later, but they are central to the book. I found that pretty interesting. I knew about the protests, but I didn't really know much about them or what went on there.
And I thought that was one of the stronger sections of the book as well. Also felt like a standalone short story.
Yeah, I agree. When I was a boy, we took a school trip to Alcatraz, and they did teach us a little bit about the protest in 1970, I believe, but they didn't emphasize it in the way that they probably should have. It was just like a historical curiosity rather than something to really focus on.
Right. From what I remember about those tours, they focus a lot more on,
The prison.
right, the characters that inhabited the prison.
And that is, once again, the frustration, right? That Native Americans are always the historical curiosity. Do you think that this book should be taught in schools?
I think that it has a place. It should be taught. The difficulty is because it does have some adult themes. I don't know if it would be a good book for young people, but maybe in like a junior or senior year of high school English class, I think that might be appropriate.
I think so too. I do think that this can be taught. I think it would do well in probably senior level class.
I think this is the kind of book that would be proposed by some very plucky and high-minded young English teacher in a conservative high school, and all of the parents would get up in arms about it, and it'd very quickly be removed from the syllabus.
Yeah. Well, especially because of the gun, right? The gun that's in the novel, or the guns. I think some parents will definitely have an issue with the violence, even if they don't have an issue with it being written from a certain ethnic point of view.
I suppose, but I can think of many books that were assigned at a much younger age that involved very violent deaths by guns, by hangings, things like that.
All books that I'm sure parents loved.
Well, books that are lauded. You know, a lot of the books that have to do with the African American slave narratives or Jim Crow.
Right. I mean, my comment's more of a tongue-in-cheek comment about how parents will get up in arms, pardon the pun, about any book that has violence. Whereas I will raise my children on violence.
Not to spoil your joke, but I think you're actually right here that it's done, I think, on purpose to carry it out of history and into the present day. It's significant that this is in the novel, the guns that they use are 3D printed guns. And there are characters using Facebook and flying drones. It's meant to be contemporary. It's meant to show that these historical things have a contemporary impact. And I think that is what makes it feel more unsettling than it would be if it happened in, the 1800s.
Yeah, and actually that's one of the aspects of the novel that I liked, was how he makes a conscious effort to include modernity, whereas a lot of Native American novels, and he's been on the record, talking about this, like a lot of Native American literature doesn't. It's always focused on the reservation. It doesn't have a lot of contemporary culture attached to it. So that's really interesting to me. I agree. I think it'll be a good book for high school syllabus. And I read a review. I think it was an interview even. I don't remember, but we'll find it and link it in the show notes. It was in the Paris Review, I believe, where they talked about how this book was published around the same time Sherman Alexie had his fall from grace because of the allegations of sexual impropriety. And he actually, Sherman Alexie, was going to have a scholarship named after him at the school that Tommy Orange attended in Santa Fe. And Tommy Orange acknowledged Sherman Alexie for his influence as well and his support. But the review was talking about how there needs to be a different voice in Native American fiction, because for a really long time, it was Sherman Alexie and maybe Louise Erdrich, who's really good. But I mean, that Love Medicine was written like a really long time ago. I don't know exactly when, at least 30 years ago, I think. So there is a place for a much more contemporary Native American novel or Native American work.
Even if we do have very similar stories to what's already been printed, this is a modern take. It's an updated version. And even if the stories haven't changed too much, we're in need of something new and good. And this is both.
Well, the danger in minority fiction is that there is a feeling in the wider publishing world that there can be only one. And now that we're off of Sherman Alexie, now Tommy Orange is the guy. And I think what we really need is for there not to be just one, but for there to be a plurality of voices. So if they do overlap, you still get some variety.
All right, let's conclude here. Thank you for listening. You can find our reading schedule on Reddit at Canonical Pod, where we also regularly post threads for discussion. We'd love for you to join us. You can also find us on social media at Canonical Pod. That's Canonical Pod, one word. We'll be back next week with a more in-depth discussion on There. If you're interested in following our discussion, just go ahead and find a copy of the book and read it before next week's episode. If you want to support us, you can use our Amazon link below to buy a copy of There or another book that you've been wanting to read. Till next time, happy reading, and we'll talk to you soon.